All right. So, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, or good night, wherever you are. My name is Dr. Kevin Johnson. I am an instructional supervisor for a nonprofit called Education Through Music. And what I'm presenting today is my perspective on the intersection of music education and social justice. I will preface this by saying, if you're looking for an excellent source to jump into and read through regarding this specific topic, I recommend the Oxford Handbook of Social Justice and Music Education. This has been my companion. I actually have another copy in my office in New York City that's marked up, lots of sticky notes everywhere. I kind of ordered it last fall, last September, and just ate it up. And I ate it up in response to, a small event that happened in my workplace surrounding race and repertoire. And it was directed towards me. And, at the end of it, I was kind of, in my mind, why can't we just talk about this topic? It didn't necessarily resolve the way I wanted to. I wanted to speak more about race and repertoire, but the conversation might have been uncomfortable, and that's all right. But, it was, why can't we just talk about it? We're in education. We should be able to talk about every single facet of life. We should be able to, speak truth to power and kind of understand where we may be uncomfortable, where we may not be capable, and where we need to grow. And so before, I dive in too hard, I just want to, let's see. I'm going to share with you my screen for my presentation. And we're just going to jump right into this. I encourage you, I'll leave my email at the end of this. If you have questions for me specifically regarding any of these topics, or you're looking for more literary resources, you want to discuss any of the resources that I will share at the end of the presentation, I'll be more than happy to respond. And again, I'll leave you my email. And then also the Teachers Lounge is available, and I will sign on to that after this is done if you want to talk to me some more. So again, you'll have my email, and then I'll hang around on the Teachers Lounge for a little bit if you want to ask some specific questions of me. But this presentation is about having the conversation, because we must understand each other, and then we must take action. So with Education and Music, I've been fortunate enough to have a couple of series surrounding social justice and music education. And it's not just about talking about the work, but it's about doing the work in order to have some type of effectual change. And so Education Through Music, who we are, we serve approximately 36,000 students per week throughout New York City schools. That's both public and parochial. We have approximately 7 partner schools spread across all 5 boroughs. We believe that music education is a core subject. Every child at every school deserves access to high quality music education. We provide all the resources needed in every partner school to implement a high quality music education program. And we try to do that with equity. And so when it comes to, the physical resources like orth sets or boom whackers, instruments, things that allow our children to actually have hands-on practice and engagement with music, we will provide a teacher. For partnerships, we will train teachers, whether we provide them or whether they are already in place at the school. So we offer a robust professional development curriculum for our teachers. Most recently, we did a 6 or 7 week webinar series on Wednesdays to help our teachers adjust to distance learning thanks to COVID-19. So, we're really dedicated to trying to do the work to make sure that all music educators are capable. And so if you have more questions about us, I encourage you to go to our website, www.etmonline.org, and check us out, ask us some questions. I'll be there. And so getting started today, I'll just give you a brief view of, what I plan to do during our session together and our brief time together. I will go through some introductions, some inquiries, objectives, considerations, and a little bit of prior knowledge, because that's always important when we teach. I will ask you all to define yourselves, which, depending on how much you've engaged in the topic of social justice, will require some honest self-reflection. It's not one of those moments where I want you to look in a distorted mirror and realize that you are all slim and trim. I want you to see yourself for who you may really be. I certainly don't see that when I look in the mirror. That's why I'm trying to work out in the morning. Definitely, I want us to define social justice. and I will give you my own opinion of that definition. We will briefly go through music education as a policy in America. I will talk about an approach, and again, I read this approach through the Oxford Handbook, but then I've also taken some time to kind of retitle some things based on my own interpretation. We will get into some troubleshooting, because that's always an important aspect. You can't just talk about something, you have to actually acknowledge the problems that you are most likely going to face within yourself or others as you go through this. And then, we have to talk about the application. So doing the honest questions, answering the honest questions again, and understanding our environments, because that plays a huge role in social justice and its impact. And then, of course, next steps, where do we go from here? Whether you find me, in the email space, whether you go to ETM and you ask them questions, and you start trying to take in our webinar series that we offer, there are next steps, and there's always a next step, because it will never be enough. Just speaking frankly. So social justice is an endless collection of subjects and how we as humans interact with them. As educators, we should be ready and willing to engage in conversations centered in social justice topics. Change cannot occur if we remain rooted in silence. It is a prerequisite as an educator, I believe, in any country, no matter where you are in the world, to figure out a way to engage with this topic. If you are hiding the topics and the themes of social justice, it is my personal opinion that you are probably committing social injustice, or, just to be truthful, educational malpractice. Education is about the pursuit of truth and understanding. And so if you are not building your students, no matter what age they are, to engage in that truth and to understand when they leave your classroom, or when they leave your school, or when they leave your town or your state or your country, then you have some more work to do. I know myself, I will always have work to do, and that's okay. But this is also about you as an educator finding where you have room to improve, because we all do. This is humanity we're talking about. So no one's going to be perfect in engaging in this. So objectives, the first thing is I'm going to ask you to be real. I want you to understand yourselves, your students, and your environment. Next, I will ask you to make the call, determine the greater good, which we will define later, and values for the sake of your students. You are providing a service. You are in the service industry. You are serving your children and leading them to something greater. They should be better when they leave your four walls or open space, depending on the format of your school. And then finally, I want you to speak up. I want you to engage in conversations rooted in social justice. And again, this is going to be a broad topic, as we'll be able to understand relatively soon. And so the biggest question is, I know many of you are logging in from many parts of the world in so many different time zones, and you're taking the time out on your Saturday morning or Saturday night or Friday night. You get the idea. Why in the world are you going to log on to this at this moment and try to listen to me talk about social justice? There's a question that's probably burning in you, some moment, whether you are American and the moment is now, and our atmosphere and our climate is screaming that you need to do something now as a music educator, and what can you do? Whether you've had an uncomfortable moment addressing race, maybe there was a debate about repertoire, maybe you have somebody new in your classroom who doesn't look like the rest of your students, and you're figuring out what in the world are you going to do. Maybe you have one student who, unfortunately, sometimes they call frequent flyers, that just can't seem to give you an easy time. Or maybe it's the opposite. That student comes to you for solace. What is it about your practice that gives that student relief from the rest of the school? It's happened to me where I've had students run to my classroom to retreat from whatever's going on in their other classes. Why is that? Was it the way I treated them and not necessarily my content? Or maybe it was my content. Maybe music was calling to them. Maybe they felt value in my classroom, in what I was teaching or how I was teaching them. So there are some questions that you need to ask yourselves as an educator. So let's dive in some more. I want you to consider a couple of things, and I put these as plainly as I possibly can. Who you are matters, literally. And we will go through that in a few slides, but who you are matters literally. Where you grew up, how you identify. Are you white? Are you an indigenous person? Are you Pacific Asian American? Are you Black? You know, who you are matters literally. Are you, you know, in American terms, Republican or Democrat or independent or something completely else? That matters in the context of social justice. But who your students are matters too. And yes, every single one of them. If you have a classroom of 99% Black and 1 white, then social justice begs that you make sure that the curriculum reflects everything and that's in your classroom. If you have a classroom that has children of the Latinx community, your craft begs that you treat everyone with respect and equally. Now, there are some you know, pitfalls to this, because sometimes the curriculum may lean towards one demographic, repertoire may lean towards one demographic. Your job is to balance the scale so that there is equity. It's okay to be different. You know, I know some people, I know we keep talking about this, but some people say, I don't see color. Personally, I think that's a lie. I see lots of colors. There are lots of colors in the room that's in front of me. You know, I see color when I look at my hand. I don't see just a hand, I see a Black hand, and that's all right with me. I embrace that, that's okay. And it does not bother me for someone else to tell me that I am Black. I understand that, but you know, you should understand that it's okay to be different from me. It's okay to be different from your students and for them to be different from each other. You should feel comfort in that difference. You should see color. You should see differences in opinion and hear differences in opinion. You should see differences in upbringing. This is not about raising robots. This is not about entertaining autonomous robotic figures inside your classroom. The idea is that every single child is different and comes from someplace different and is raised differently, and that's okay. The next thing is that sensitivities will vary when engaging in this. Some people are not ready to have this conversation. No matter their racial identity, no matter their political affiliation, no matter their religious beliefs, not everyone is ready to have this conversation. And while personally, you know, I wish everybody was, that's humanity. Some people are going to be afraid. There's going to be fear. There's going to be shame. There's going to be guilt when we talk about some of these topics. And that's all right. Educators, your job is to try to move past all of those frames, all of those states of being and minds. If you are afraid, figure a way to get some bravery. If you are ashamed, it's okay. It's called growth. If there's guilt, find a way to make up for that moment. So we all kind of know about education. That's kind of obvious. So I don't want to spend too much time defining what is music education during this practice. It's in our DNA. But you know, what do we know about social justice? That's really where I want to get to. But first, we have to define ourselves. And so it's coming very soon. I hope you guys are getting ready. Please understand there's going to be a couple of polls coming soon. So if you're not sure about the polls in your screen, make sure that you're ready to engage with those when the time comes. But let's identify some of the constructs that we use for ourselves. How do you or your students or parents mirror any of these constructs? Just, this is rhetorical. You don't have to answer yet if you don't want to. Race, political affiliations, economic upbringing, gender identity, pedagogical background, or your own construct. I'm not saying these are all. There are so many out there. I just want to keep this as simple as possible in our talk. You can do the work of defining and creating your own constructs as we go through this, or even after the presentation if you want to dive in. But I think it is prudent of me to also give you an example of my own constructs, the things that I believe define me. And so first off, I've said it before, but I'm Black. I've, you know, in the past used African-American, and I won't get into it, but now I'm learning to define myself as Black for my own terminology and my own identity. Independent is where I typically feel I lie in politics in America. Admittedly, it's not feeling very independent lately. That's my own personal view. But typically, it's not my loyalty to a party that gets my vote. It's policy that gets my vote. It's vision that gets my vote. But again, that's, you know, not quite independent lately, just because I'm not really enjoying the policies or the visions that are always being put forth by some of the parties here in this country. I am a Christian. I have always been. I have practiced no other. I've studied others just because, I've taught other subjects before. And, in my pursuit of being an educator, to understand some of my students, I had to understand where they came from or where they come from. And so, I am a Christian, for whatever that means to any of you. I am middle class. Now, I also have to preface this with my parents are middle class, but they did not start off in middle class. And so that actually informs me of who I am, because they actually made sure to understand where we could have been based on their own choices. We, would visit often, their old neighborhood. There are several documentaries out there about their old neighborhood and the way they grew up, which is fascinating. There's actually a recent one we were watching the other day. I can't really say the title because it's not necessarily appropriate for this space, but it's on, I believe it's on the Showtime network, and it is Burn, explicative burn. It is a documentary based on race riots across America, particularly focusing on Los Angeles, where my parents grew up in the 1960s. So, very fascinating stuff. That's not how I grew up. Let's see. I am heterosexual and I am cisgender. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the term cisgender, it means that my personal identity and my gender correspond with my birth sex. All right. And for me, because I'm trying to improve, I am trying to expand my terminology. I did not always use the term cisgender. I don't believe the term has always been in existence. But again, for me, because I am trying to improve on, my level of conversation, I am learning to grab hold of new terms and engage with them. Pedagogical background, I have a Bachelor of Arts from Morehouse College, which is a historically Black college in Atlanta, Georgia, the alma mater of Martin Luther King. I have a master's in music. I went to Roosevelt University, the Chicago Conservatory. I have a doctorate of musical arts from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. I started teaching through a fellowship for elementary school. I landed on my feet as a teacher teaching English and social studies for sixth grade. And then for that charter school that I was working for, I eventually ended up developing several STEM summer programs. So I didn't start with music, even though I had the bachelor's and the master's. Eventually, that school did ask me to take over their music program. And I stayed with that for, the second half of my career. But I wasn't always a music teacher. I taught middle school, I taught English, I taught social studies. I've literally written and implemented STEM programs. So that's, my pedagogical background. And I believe that Black lives matter. I believe that my life matters. It doesn't mean that other lives don't matter. But right now, I believe my life is the one that is in a struggle, And so, it's just like a row of houses on a street. If there's one particular house that's burning down, you don't douse them all with water. You actually just dive in with the house that's on fire and you put that fire out. So I believe that Black lives matter. Simple explanation. You may not agree with me, for all intents and purposes, and we don't have to get into that argument today. This is not necessarily exactly about that particular viewpoint. And so, audience members, it's time to poll. And so I'm going to push a poll to you. The first poll I want to push to you says, do you look like the majority of your students? And this is for you all to poll. Again, do you look like the majority of your students? I know I've said it before that, it's okay to be different from the students in your classroom. It's all right. It's all right if you see differences. And we have the numbers are coming in. It's actually kind of fascinating. We're almost at half. Wow. Most of you look like your students, and that's fantastic. It's actually going back and forth. It's actually a beautiful thing to see this data in real time. It's kind of fascinating. I'm going to end the poll very soon, though. Just looking at this right now, fortunately for me, my answer would have been yes. That's fortunate for me. And, I believe for my students, I looked like the majority of them. Did I look like all of them? Absolutely not. But most of my students, I started education as a part-time tutor in Southside Chicago. And then when I went full-time, I was full-time in Washington, D.C. in the teaching fellowship in Southeast D.C. and then moved to Northwest DC. So, you know, all my students have pretty much looked like me from the start. Next question I want to poll you on. Did you grow up like them? And this is going to be something completely different. My answer would be no. I did not grow up like my students, but I know why I did not grow up like my students. And that's okay. It doesn't mean I think any differently of them. It just means I embrace them for who they are and how they've grown up. And, you know, often what I used to do as a teacher is, because I did not grow up like them, I would actually go out into the community where they lived. I would walk around it during my lunch breaks, whether I was on the phone or whether I was just looking around. I would, you know, shop in the local food stores. You know, I wouldn't always bring my lunch. I wanted to see, you know, the people that are serving, you know, my students, you know, understand where they go after school. You know, it's one thing to, you know, see the corner store right across from your school, but it's another to actually go into the corner store, talk to those guys, and have them know you well enough for them to understand that you work and you serve and you care about the students that are giving them business, because that's actually very, very important. Wow. The next poll says, did you grow up in the same area? The next poll again says, did you grow up in the same area? And this is also important. Places and spaces change, especially in America. Places and spaces change, especially in America. You know, what's commonly called now gentrification. You know, when I moved to DC, whew, it definitely was different from the day I moved in to the day my wife and I left. DC is not the same place it was, for me at least. And so there's that. If you grew up in the same area, you know, I remember my childhood in my hometown. Yeah, some interesting things. Parts of that neighborhood did not change at all, which is interesting. Other parts did. But, you know, I think for me personally that my area, my childhood upbringing, that area typically is very traditional, holds on to traditions, is rooted in things that make them proud. Really, the only thing that really changed much was the football field went from grass to turf. Go figure. I'll save that for another day. The next question I want us to get into is, do you share the same political views as their families? Do you share the same political views as their families? And this is very important. I know sometimes families are concerned about what their teachers are saying in classrooms. And that's always an eternal struggle. You know, parents will say, why are you bringing politics into the classroom? You know, you're supposed to just do your job, teach English, or in this case, teach music. You know, politics have nothing to do with music. That's a lie. If you take a music history, you know, politics have always been integrated with music. That's just kind of how it is. You know, ask the church. You know, politics has always been there. And so it is a lie to suggest that politics don't belong in music or that they do not exist in music. They've always been there. And some of our greatest collections of repertoire are created as a response to politics. So, you know, do you share the same political views? This can be a yes or no. And it's all right if it's different. I'm not saying it's bad. You know, oh no, you don't have the same political views as your family. That's not what I'm saying by any means. But just recognizing who you are and who you serve is vitally important as a music educator. The next question, do you practice the same religion? And, you know, I took this question for granted as an educator. Do you practice the same religion? I admit I did. You know, I had it what I could guess one would say made, if you will. You know, for the most part, the students I taught, they were all Christian, until I was teaching music, and I realized that there were other religious practices inside of my classroom, and I was made aware of it in response to some of the repertoire that you know, was present in the textbooks. And it was kind of like one of those moments where I had to apologize for it. You know, I wasn't making myself aware. I was wrong in the moment. But I did do some heavy work to to fix that. I was working in a multicultural school, and so the idea was, how can I work in a multicultural school if I'm not considering the backgrounds of my students? Again, mistakes that I have made as an educator that I'm willing to admit. It's okay to not have the same religious practice, but you should know what's in your classroom. That should inform you of what's in your classroom. Not all students are going to be able to engage in your classroom equally, and that's just to be honest. I've had parents to say flat out they don't want their child in my class because they don't want them to grow up to be a musician or musicians against their beliefs. That happens. That's real. So I'm encouraging you all to make sure that you try to understand that. And again, it's okay to be different. The last question I want to ask you: do you hold the same values around LGBTQIA+ issues? And this is really, really important these days because our children are becoming more aware of who they are. They're having access to the world. They're understanding choice. They're understanding autonomy. Are you comfortable with that? There are students that are able to articulate their stances at young age in elementary school. And we have to acknowledge that students are empowered now. But do you have the same values around it? Are you able to talk about it comfortably? Or there's a student or a family that's in existence that's connected to your classroom that's not ready to have that conversation, that is afraid of an agenda, as I've heard and dealt with. And yes, I've dealt with this instance before of the fear of an agenda of some sort, of exposing children to LGBTQIA+, issues or thoughts and concerns, and really just following some sort of, agenda. Again, I don't know what the agenda is because my job is just to speak to humanity and teach humanity, and good humanity at that. But, that again, parents have their views. And so what has been your background? And you should be pressing save on all these answers, mind you. And if you're able to look at the data, you should be understanding just the data in this small collection of teachers that I have before me, that we are all sharing in this moment. There was not one poll where it was 100%. Not one. So what does that tell you about, teachers in general? None of us are the same, and that's very obvious, but it needs to be said. We all grew up differently. None of us look like each other. Even if we have a sketch artist draw and leave out skin tone, none of us look like each other. None of us grew up like each other, exactly like each other, unless, some of you are siblings and around the same age. I have a sister, but we definitely did not grow up the same. That's okay. We were raised by the same two people, but we grew up differently, and I acknowledge that, and that informs us of who we are. So now, you've kind of told me everything, and now you're kind of saying, okay, well, that's great. I have all these definitions. Now what? I'm gonna tell you to press save. All the constructs, all the answers to the polls, I need you to save that somewhere in your minds, whether you have a notepad in front of you or a piece of paper, save it somewhere, or write it out as I'm talking to you, because this is important work. This is important information. Especially if you've answered it honestly, and that's a beautiful thing if you did. So I thank you all for your participation in those polls, because it's just, it is vital to start to engage in that. Looking at the chat, and I wish mine had the perspective, shows that, yeah, you as an educator will decide in these parameters when you will not push back. And I can't tell you the answer for your specific place, because again, every place is different, but you should, at least as an educator, be aware for your own sake in your own teaching. That's the place to start. So let's go into social justice. There's a wonderful quote I, again, pulled from the Oxford Handbook. It says, "What is unjust to some is not unjust to others." If this was a lie, everybody in America at least would be on the same page with Black Lives Matter. Truth. But instead, there's Black Lives Matter, I think there's Green Lives Matter, there's Blue Lives Matter, there's All Lives Matter. Everybody's in a different place. That's humanity. Even though some of us believe that we're screaming for what we feel is the right one, we have to also understand humanity calls us to be different and to respond differently. And so justice itself highlights and supports the values of an individual or individuals. I'm not sure to put that in there. That's all right, though. Justice is premised on right and wrong. And again, what we think of right is a construct. Wrong is a construct. We won't get into that. An individual's values are shaped by powers or institutions of power. This is very, very important. We'll go over some institutions of power, but things like church. Church can actually inform you of what your values are. There are many in America right now. Wherever you are in the world in your religious practice, it creates a set of values that you probably live by and understand. And as values change, so does the collective's idea of justice. So values inform justice and impact it directly. And so these are some forms of justice that I just want you guys to be aware of. There's procedural justice. There's commutative justice. There's a long list, bear with me. Divine justice, retributive justice, distributive justice, natural law, poetic justice, legal justice, instrumental justice, and restorative justice. And these are not all, but I put a lot out here. And when I'm putting this up and looking at this screen, there's some questions. Some of you probably said, I know that, or I've never heard of that before. Well, what is familiar to you? What is not familiar to you? And why? And the answer is, if you want to do a drum roll, the answer is very simple. Your constructs, your race, your economic upbringing, your religious affiliation, your political affiliation, your pedagogical background, your gender identity, your own construct, all these things, plus, the answers to your polls have informed you of who you are. They represent you. And because your answers are different, your experience in some of these lanes of justice are going to be different. And again, that's okay. But what is social justice? So I've put in here some definitions to offer you from a couple of perspectives, and I put where they come from into this slide as well. And so the first one, reading it out loud for you: social justice refers to a concept in which equity or justice is achieved in every aspect of society rather than only some aspects or for some people. And that's from the National Education Association. The next definition says that social justice is the objective of creating a fair and equal society in which each individual matters, their rights are recognized and protected, and decisions are made in ways that are fair and honest. That's from the Oxford University Press. Nonprofit, the San Diego Foundation, says that social justice means equal rights, opportunity, and treatment for all. And finally, I just say social justice is about equity and access for all. And pretty much all of the issues and concerns and lanes regarding social justice, I can throw them into equity or access. So that's, for me, that's a plain-facing definition that allows me to take action. And so for the purposes of this presentation and this moment and your work afterwards, I would like you to use this image as an idea of how social justice can impact your practice. And so somewhere on another planet is music education. And you need to use the telescope to actually take a view of it, to look at the craters and how the atmosphere is formed, to understand its terrain and what makes that planet of music education exactly what it is. And as you're looking at it, you change the lenses to actually understand a different detail of social justice. And so these are some lenses, but not all. Again, you have race. You could take the lens of race and look at music education as a practice, whether it's directly in the repertoire, whether it's in your behavior management, whether it's in just the simple presence of students in your classroom and how you're going to handle that as far as the curriculum is concerned. I can, use the scope of politics to talk and look at music education. Economics, that's very, very important because that talks about resources and access to those resources and creating equity by students having access to those resources. Representation, again, this goes back to, do students see themselves in your classroom, whether it's in the curriculum or the repertoire, or access. So these are just some lenses to look through. But if you extract nothing else, this is how I want you to look at your craft as music educators, through this scope of social justice. And so now, defining the greater good and its evolution as a policy in music in America. Music education has been part of public policy in American education for a considerable amount of time. Policies have aimed to serve the greater good and can be transformative even when not successful. But what is the greater good? Music education in America has traditionally represented the interest and values of, this is important, the dominant social group. Therefore, the greater good has been controlled by this population. And so greater good, benefiting the dominant social group, accepting that others may not benefit, versus benefiting the largest amount of people possible, accepting that not all may benefit. Based on these two definitions, I actually tend to stick to the lower definition, benefiting the dominant social group, accepting that others, and I capitalize that on purpose, may not benefit. And we'll talk about that later, or soon rather. And so greater good, it is going to be different, to say the least. I put a timeline here, and you can apply this to wherever you are, wherever state, wherever country, wherever you're viewing this, however you are viewing this. What was the greater good? What was the benefit of the dominant social group in 1900? Who was the dominant social group in 1900? From the American standpoint, the argument can be made that the dominant social group was the American white male. In 1920, American white women were given some say in that. And so the social group, the dominant social group, increased, it changed. But then what happens in 1940? Who was the dominant social group in 1960, wherever you are? In regards to the greater good and dominant social groups, what has changed between all of these dates that are before you from 1900 to 2020? Imagine what those answers could be in every country of the world, in every state within this country. It changes. I mean, what is the dominant social group now? Has that changed from 1900? Yes or no? And remember, I said, others may not benefit. And so policy, the greater good has always been determined by those in power, the dominant social group. Politics, religion, the arts, commercialism, familial, they all have some level of power. And these institutions of power enforce rules and laws which serve some form of justice. So honestly, as a music educator, as a person who is impacting students every day, sometimes maybe around like 180 days out of the year, what do you value? What are your values? And better yet, what should you value? A friend of mine, his name's Dr. Gregory Denson, he works for Georgia Schools, Cobb County. I asked him this question when we had our talk about social justice, a close colleague of mine. His answer was beautifully put. It was, I value being a good human. However, what does that mean? Because everyone has a different imprint or idea of what makes a good human. The next question, which will, speak to some of you who are struggling with your environment, do your values match with your place of work? And then, of course, I'm going to ask, better yet, should they? As you as an educator, should your values match where you are serving? Whether it's your school, whether it's your town, whether you work for an organization that is rooted in education, do your personal values match with your place of work? And should they? I'm not going to answer that for you. I have my personal opinions, but for you, answer for yourselves. And so talking about an approach, I want us to get into this idea of otherness. The term other comes with this negative connotation, whether you realize it or not. It's kind of just cast aside as not given thoughts to be labeled. Others, the label placed on individual or individuals who are not given a stake in the greater good. If other creates uneasiness, then it should be cause for self-reflection. Others exist. If they didn't, then we would not have this talk about social justice. And so I want to talk about some approaches that I've, extracted from the handbook. And admittedly, I've relabeled some to kind of fit the idea of maintaining this attachment to the other. Okay. And so the first idea I have is that's in there is education for the other. This is equalizing conditions, expectations, and opportunities for the marginalized and the oppressed. That's an approach. You are equalizing conditions, your expectations of everyone, especially for the marginalized and oppressed. There's education of the other, which focuses on issues of representation by accurately teaching on the experiences of the other while challenging the hierarchies that support dominant views on what is important to know. And so this is excellent highlight for the term decolonizing, right? And so it's the idea of eliminating this dominant view that has been placed on music repertoire surrounding Western European and white American, repertoire. The idea that we're changing the narrative about what is dominant and what is important to know so that we are being more inclusive of everything that exists. Our repertoire is not just Western European music. We know this. We engage with stuff outside of that realm every day, but why don't we put that into our curriculum? Why doesn't our curriculum represent the faces that are in our classroom, the experiences in our classroom, the beliefs inside of our classrooms? The next thing I want to highlight is education eliminating the other. And I don't mean like eliminate. I understand that's why I had to write it the way I did. But it's the idea that educators must teach about oppression while also trying to change society, create the expectation that all students will participate in this change. And the idea is that eventually, if you do this work, you will not need to have the idea of an other present in your classroom. There is equity. And so we are eliminating and doing the work to eliminate the need for an other. And then there's finally education with the other, and that's, education that seeks to frame conversations around how we feel, think, and act. And so it's the idea of everybody doing the work and having the conversation so everybody is heard equally, again, about how we think, feel, and act. And so next, troubleshooting. And these are some things that I believe that we should accept when we are trying to implement and look at social justice and its impact on our craft of music education. Social justice depends on the greater good for guidance. That's just a truth, for me at least. And though we all believe that our humanity gives us the ability to unify around a greater good, it doesn't always seem to work out that way. One of the obvious examples would be that's why people are protesting right now in America. Remembering the timeline that I showed you, the greater good is always in constant flux. It's always changing. It will change from country to country, from decade to decade, and from society to society. You have to accept that if you're going to do the work. If you are truly invested in social justice intersecting with your classroom, you must accept that the demands may change. I also should put in here or add that you should accept that you may be wrong at some point. I may be wrong at some point. I may be wrong now. I'm expressing my opinion. But the idea is, when you understand that you may be wrong, what are you doing to fix that problem? Whether it's in your pedagogy, whether it's in your repertoire, what are you doing to fix the problem? If it's in your curriculum, what are you doing to fix the problem? In your continued education, in your interactions with students, what are you doing to fix the problem? It's okay to be wrong as long as you are willing to fix it when you discover that. Equity. Practicing social justice means you must address the inequality in your repertoire, curriculum, pedagogy, and classroom management. And this is very important. All means all, not just some, and on the occasion, all. A friend of mine uses the term consistent consistency. It's the idea that, we always claim to be consistent. We're really, reflecting in our practices and trying to be equitable in, how we present music education or the content to students. But are we really? Are we doing that consistently, or do we sometimes get tired of it and just kind of segue into, default into something that may be deemed a little bit more easy to do? Finally, competence. It should be the objective of any educator to instill competence in their student, according to your content. Anything less is falling short of the expectations around equity in your practice. And, for me, that's That's part of social injustice or malpractice. You are aiming to make sure that your students are competent. And as music educators, they should be competent in the content of music. Does that mean they're going to understand everything? No. In time, maybe. And if you are in a forever school where you might have your impact on pre-K through 5th grade education, you can get a lot in those 8 years, or for DC 8 years, pre-K 3 through grade 5. You have a lot of time. If you're in high school, you have 4 years. You have the space to do so. So why not try to approach your curriculum with equity? Why not invest in it so that your students are competent when they leave? Your students should be gaining what I've read to be cultural fluency. They should be able to understand the music that represents them and represents those of their peers equally. And then you can start adding layers to that. The students that might not be in the classroom, populations that'll be in your towns, and we'll talk about that. So an application, and I discovered that students will give you two. Yeah, I personally have not had a problem telling students that I am wrong, but I always try to frame it so that students understand that I've already figured out I'm wrong and I'm already working to fix it. And then there are some things, yes, I won't admit, but if I need to apologize to students, I want to show them that I am human and that as an adult, I am willing to learn, because I would expect them to learn to apologize. And so, I don't often have a problem with telling students I'm wrong. It's just how I tell them that matters to me, because educators, you've always got to frame the conversation so that you can control it. That's being honest. The greater good, I gave you an example of a place that's near and dear to me, my hometown of Hackensack, New Jersey. And the greater good, what value does my town place in the performing arts? When I was in high school, I was in the marching band. I played euphonium and I played tuba. And then eventually I was a drum major. And I remember the marching band, we practiced in a parking lot that had white spray paint on it. And it was a hill. And not just any hill, like it was a huge hill. I remember, learning to ride a bike on that hill and falling off going down because I forgot to put on the brakes and scraping my knee. It was a huge hill. And that was, at the time, the value we were given. We were not, as a marching band, allowed to use the grass of the football field. I kid you not. We were not allowed to use the grass. And so what value was, my school and my town placing on the performing arts, and particularly marching band at that time? Not a lot, I can tell you that. They really didn't start paying attention to the marching band until we started placing, go figure. But what was the value of that? What did my town think of it, about the performing arts? I can tell you right now, Hackensack has a performing arts center now. That's a beautiful thing. That has changed because that was not always there. What are the values of the dominant social group at each level? New Jersey genuinely, I would say it loves its music, but it depends on the town and the taxpayer money that goes into the town. Not all towns have marching band or access to marching bands or spaces for marching bands. That's the truth. Not all towns want performing arts centers or want to hear music played in the neighborhood and the practicing. The values change at every level. Nationally, where do we sit when it comes to performing arts? I mean, it should be obvious for me, at least, to see budget cuts to the National Endowment for the Arts. What do we value as a nation? I know COVID-19 is forcing schools to make tough decisions on budget cuts across the world, most likely. And there are going to be administrators that will go right. They will go straight to the arts for their budget cuts. What value are they placing on the arts in that moment? This is how you could start viewing the greater good wherever you are. And so, some self-reflection. Again, who are you? What don't they know about you? And that's your students. What don't your students know about you? And that's a very pointed question. Who are your students? And what don't you know about them? This, my friends, is about values. This does not mean that, in response to this, and you immediately give your entire, life story to your students. You tell them every facet of your life. No, but when I go back to that term that my friend used, being a good human, that is a value. But what don't they know about you? Is there something that they should not know about you, or they should know about you, that's going to help inform them about who you are, that's going to help them bond to you? Very general question for you. But I caution you, because not everything is going to be for student consumption. The purpose of this is not to say that you go back into your classrooms and you read an entire list of everything you've ever done in your life, everything that you believe in, because what's going to happen? Someone with some different sensitivities is going to react. So I'm not saying that by any means. I have a friend who, was accused of introducing students to homosexuality, and he was fired from his job. That's unfortunate. And I don't blame him, but the values of that particular society where he was teaching, they weren't for that. They did not believe that that was part of instruction. That would not happen in New York City, but where my friend was teaching, it certainly happened, because the greater good, or the set of values that his particular region had, are completely different from where I live. And so let's go into determining your approach. Where will you start? Are your students competent in the repertoire that represents them? What about their peers? How do you manage your classroom? Does every child respond equally to your management? Does your curriculum and content mirror the faces in your classroom? This is the realm of the other, for me at least. And equity requires that you determine a response to each lane. Sometimes the other is the student who does not behave according to your expectations or the class's expectations. Sometimes the other is going to be the student that doesn't have the same background as the majority of students in the classroom. These are just, realities that we face. You should make a plan. And as I said, think long-term investment. You want students to engage meaningfully and authentically in the unknown. I want you to start thinking units, not lessons. Think years in a school, not school year. Long-term investment. And I want you to understand that every student should be valued by your curriculum and your repertoire. They should find value in how you manage the class, how you accommodate for their neurodiversities, their ethnic backgrounds, and family history. The same is true for how they learn about their peers. The same is true for populations present in the area but not yet represented in the school. And this should mean that you have some idea about the community where you are serving. And the same is true for populations that exist outside of the town, because eventually children leave. They grow and they spread their wings and they fly somewhere else. They engage somewhere else. Not all people are guaranteed to stay in their same little box of a town. Some people will leave. Are you making sure that your students are going to be competent enough to engage with the world? Engage with music outside of what is popularly consumed on the radio. For instance, growing up, I listened to a lot of Hot 97 and Kiss FM when it existed in New York. But that's not the only music that, is present in the world. And, the genres that those particular two stations kind of represent and always presented to their audiences. I got a whole, I went to church a lot. And so, I was familiar with gospel, but my ideas of gospel music opened up when I went to Atlanta. It was just kind of like this whole new world and library of repertoire that I had not always engaged in. And there was so much more than what I had understood from my church, again, my bubble and my area. And so are you teaching your students to engage in what is outside of the world as well? Determine your approach. And so when you are addressing students and dealing with the unknown, I want to encourage you to think about your training. As musicians, we connect through experiences in performance and creation, and your students are going to be the same way. And so, when you are thinking about like repertoire that represents their peers, it's a tricky one. Well, not a tricky one. It should be obvious. There are things that you do not do, correct? You don't say, You don't engage in minstrel songs. You don't do blackface. Those are obvious things. But you can actually engage in music of Black and brown composers. You can look at the music of indigenous peoples, of Pacific Asians. You can include music of, Western European, but there should be some sort of equity. And the faces in your classroom should see their value and their representation in your repertoire, in their curriculum, about who they learn about. It's not equitable to just focus on Hispanic Heritage Month, September 15th through October 15th. That's not equitable just to, use that month to focus on Latinx composers, contributors to music. It's not equitable to use February to focus on Black music. That's not equitable. Would we really need that if we were equitable in our policies, in our approach at the beginning? Those things are in existence to allow for some sort of equity to take place. That doesn't mean that it's equitable. We should be teaching about everything all the time. We should, again, understand that the students are not waiting for February to engage in Black history in music. They should have the chance to engage in Black history in music in August or in May. This is not a one-off. And so this idea of the students should be existing in these spaces with equity. They should be having the chance to have some moment to, improve their self-esteem, understand who they are in these spaces and engage. And that's very, very important. And so it's not necessarily just performance, but it's our teaching understanding of history, of pedagogy, how you address your students. What power do they have in your classroom? Do all students have the same power in your classroom? There are so many ways to approach this and deal with this. I just want to make sure that you are understanding that students must actually live and experience these moments in order for it to be meaningful and to be impactful. Do your students have the chance to be, to be powerful in their own classroom? You tell me, or is it always teacher talk, student listen? Is there student talking? Is there student leading? Does the student have a chance to actually, understand who they are? I can keep going, but let's move on. So, next steps in this for you all, where in the world do we go from here? I want you to consider some things. This is about starting the conversation and addressing it. It's not necessarily about one specific thing that you can do next. Ask yourself, are you meeting the needs of every student? Is every student represented in your teaching? Yes, no, maybe so. Are students given every resource at your disposal and at the school's disposal? Does every child have the opportunity to be successful in your class? And be honest, what about those red flags or those frequent flyers? Are they receiving equal opportunity to be successful in your space? Or are you still praying for their absence? Be real. Because those students are not going to have the same opportunity in your class if you can't even welcome them every day. Are your students able to engage in content through their own lens and those of their peers? I can't answer that question for you, only you can, and you have to be honest about that. What in your repertoire, your pedagogy, your curriculum, what have you done to make sure that all students see themselves equally, see themselves as an equal in their classroom? Do they feel their value when they're with you? Does the value that they feel, is that different from what their peers feel? Race, representation, and repertoire. What does your teaching footprint look like in each instant? You should evaluate this for yourself. Whether you open up your lesson plans and you look at your roster and you kind of go through and start doing check marks and crossouts, maybe that's a place for you to start. I can't tell you where you want to start. Or maybe you need to do some more work around behavior management so it's a little bit more equitable. Or are you the giant in your classroom? Are you the sage on the stage? Are you the wizard? What are you doing? And how do you manage that classroom? And does it work for all of your students? As an educator, you must approach this topic with some honesty, some bravery, and lots of humility. Again, I can be wrong, and that's okay. I'm willing to embrace that because that means I have room to learn and to grow. Wonderful, because I will stop learning the day I die. That is my theory. What is yours? This is a broad subject, and there are many paths that you can take as you make this approach. What are your next steps? Again, I can't define it for you, but it's not my place to necessarily give you a specific mandate outside of strive for true social justice in your classrooms. Each of you serves a different community with different values, and each of you comes from a different background. Currently we're in this cultural shift as a nation where the idea of justice, what it is and how it works for everyone, is evolving with the purpose of serving the greater good. In America, again, the dominant social group, often politics play a part in policy and therefore play a part in things that contribute to that greater good. Whether the greater good is whether the majority is in power or not. And so these greater good, again, stand to be shaped by institutions of power and the struggle that they maintain amongst themselves. For American politics, lobbyists. There are religious lobbyists out there hoping to put their fingers or their pulse on the policies of laws, taxes. There's a whole lot on education. There's a whole lot out there. The point is, there's always going to be a struggle. You have to recognize where those struggles occur and at each and every level and layer, wherever you are in the world. Understand and accept that no one is perfect and no path is perfect, but trying is where growth occurs. And so, I have some resources for you all that I really, really, really want you all to consider as we go through this. I want you to start with the Oxford Handbook of Social Justice in Music Education. And, maybe they should be paying me, for this advertisement right here. But if I'm to be honest, one of the best resources right now to figure out your place in this is to read through that book. It doesn't mean you read from it from beginning to end. It's a collection of essays. I encourage you to look into that resource. Some other resources and places for you to find some work, to find a way to actually get further into the subject. There's culturally responsive teaching in music education. There's music education for social change. There's marginalized voices in music education. And one that I am starting to grow in and understand and follow a lot more is decolonizethemusicroom.com. All of these are places to start. Decide whether you want to start with your pedagogy or your curriculum, your behavior management, your repertoire. If you want to figure out how to incorporate activism into your music, the direct applications are endless. It's just about the needs that you believe are in existence in your classroom, in your school, in your town or city, in your state, and in your country, and what you want to do for your students in order to have them engage further in the future. And so with that, I want to thank you for your time with me. I want to encourage you to, reach out to me with questions. I am always willing to, answer questions and engage. If you feel that you do not have a circle around you that is willing to engage, you should improve your circle, increase your circle, improve your rapport with someone that you might want to engage in these topics with. The point is to start talking about the issues that arise in your classroom, not just, hold on to it, live in a bubble, live in fear of these conversations about race and repertoire and politics and LGBTQIA plus issues. The point is to speak up and to say something and to engage now. It is your choice where you go. If you have questions, you can reach me at kjohnson@etmonline.org, or you can learn more about the organization I work for, which is Education and Music in New York City. We have other affiliates out there. We have some in LA, we have some in Denver, and some other cities coming. And our website directly for New York is etmonline.org. I want to thank you all for joining me. I appreciate your time, for your participation in the polls. And I really, really look forward to any additional questions you have and to engaging in the conversation, because words are where it starts. And then after we're finished talking, I want us to take action. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day, morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are.